Hello.
Evening. Hi.
Great to see you both in this virtual
Likewise.
setting. This is a new format for me. So I think all of us are learning a little bit about how to communicate once more in a different virtual format. And of course, I do wish we were all together down at UCR Arts, but unfortunately, that's not to be the case tonight. So I want to invite Professors Jennings and Benjamin to join me in inviting our audience to this discussion of SANKOFA, Halle Gerima's 1993 feature-length film, which was just streamed. So hopefully some of our viewers either saw the film for the first time tonight or saw this film maybe for the 15th time tonight, but had an opportunity to take in again the storytelling, the visual storytelling that's part of the film itself, but of course, many of the other themes, which are not only visual, but also I was picking up on some things about sound, and, among other things. I do want to make sure that everyone knows that there is a learning guide that was just released by Array at SANKOFA101.org, which accompanies the film, and it's not released quite re-released, but it's released in this particular format as well. So you might want to take a look at that. So I'll introduce myself. I am Daryl Williams, and I'm a historian. I work particularly on enslavement in Brazil, 19th century Brazil, but I have worked on Brazil for quite some time. So sometimes I also stray a little bit into other themes in Brazilian history. I also serve as the Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at the University of California, Riverside. And so it's in that context that I'm really delighted to join two other colleagues here from UCR, from our college, Chaz, to have this discussion about the film. I'll go along with the learning guide as well. So why don't I ask both of you to introduce yourselves, a little bit of autobiography, if you will, and then we'll open up the conversation, this informal conversation about the film. So I'm going to turn it over first to Professor Jennings, but that's the last time I'm going to say his last name. I'm going to go to our first name basis after this. So please take it over, John, and tell us just a little bit about yourself, your disciplinary training, the work that you do, and particularly how long you've been also at UCR.
Definitely. Thank you for having me. And thank you for that wonderful kind of segue. My name is, again, John Jennings, and I'm in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. My training is as an artist. My background is in graphic design. I'm from Mississippi originally, and I went to Jackson State University for my undergraduate degree in art, particularly art and communication with a minor in drawing. And I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which my first master's is in art education, and terminal degree, which is MFA in graphic design. And so a lot of my background is in studying images and semiotics and understanding different ways that images can communicate. Design is kind of like a visual rhetoric space, right? And so when I was teaching image making at University of Illinois, I became really, really intrigued by the different ways that various identity politics started to come into traditional design. And so I just kind of became a really interdisciplinary scholar. Started doing a lot of work around hip hop and vernacular cultures and how it affects design. I've always been a massive science fiction fan, so I actually started doing a lot more research into what has now become a really massive outcropping of Black speculative studies. So here at the university, I teach classes on comics and contemporary culture, as far as like the medium of comics, Afrofuturism and horror, as far as like how the utilities of horror and race kind of intersect in transmedia spaces. Afrofuturism and the Black superhero and politics, and also a class just around aesthetics and Black speculative culture. And I've been here about 6 years or so. And it's interesting because I transitioned directly from teaching, design history, classes on methodology, design studio, and basically transitioning into being a media scholar and studying film and animation and graphic novels. So that's like a lot of my work. But I'm also a practicing artist. I do a lot of work around Black speculative culture, and and I'm a big horror fan too. So there's aspects of horror that actually intersect with this film. I could talk about a little bit later, but that's about it. So.
Thank you, John. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Benjamin. Again, the last time I'll use his last name, but Jody, please tell us a little bit about your disciplinary training, the work that you do, the courses that you teach, and of course, how long you've been with us at UCR.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this discussion. Yeah, so I'm Jody Benjamin. I'm assistant professor of history at Riverside, and I teach courses on early and modern African history. And so I've been trained as an Africanist, actually at an interdisciplinary department. And so I sort of approach my work as a historian kind of with an interdisciplinary lens. And most of my research has been in the countries of Senegal, Mali, and Guinea. And my work really looks at the social and cultural history of this region during the 18th century. And so this film and this discussion is interesting to me for a bunch of reasons, but certainly as it relates to my work, really, my work really thinks about the Atlantic slave trade period, but really setting it in a longer historical framework of West Africa itself. So actually, I spend a lot of my time thinking about some of these questions from the African side, and so that's kind of my thinking and my orientation to this question. And we can talk more about the film when we get into it, but certainly it's really exciting for me to see this after so many years, because it kind of takes me back to a time before I decided to kind of go into academia and become a historian. I had sort of an earlier background at Oberlin College as an undergraduate in Black Studies. And long story short, there's a whole bunch of questions that I was kind of obsessed with as an undergraduate that I didn't immediately pursue, and kind of had a professional career, and then went back into academia and was able to really focus on opportunities to research and write and teach about African history. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me and my background. And I've been at UCR for 6 years as well. And yeah, so I'm excited to have this conversation about such a rich film and so many directions one could go in. So thanks.
Thank you, Jody. So Jody, you queued up a little bit of a question that I certainly want to ask both of you when the first time you saw SANKOFA. But before I get to that question, I'd like to ask if you could go back before that time, your pre-SANKOFA visual literacy. Tell us about the first film that you can recall that dealt with enslavement, that dealt with the transatlantic slave trade, dealt with the life and the violence of enslavement, a film that sticks with you still as marking you. This is pre-SANKOFA. And so we could talk about that in relationship to what this film does and continues to do for your visual and, of course, scholarly and many other ways you approach the film. So, John, your film that, before you saw SANKOFA for the first time, what film still sticks with you?
Actually, the one that probably, and it's not a film per se, but it's a miniseries. Of course, it's Roots. Alex Haley's Roots. I was born in 1970, so I think when that film came, that show came out, I think it was 77, correct, or something like that. It was in the early. It was in the mid.
That's about right, yeah.
And like I said, I came up in post-civil rights era, Mississippi, post integration supposedly, and came up in a space where it's very agrarian. I was raised by my grandparents, let's say financially challenged, so to speak, and I was going, I was in this space where all of this violence and all these different issues around slavery and oppression and Jim Crow were kind of permeate the state. It's just a normal aspect of being there. But for some reason, as a child, you don't really necessarily think about these issues, right? And I want to say that Roots, just shifted everything around how I thought about it. And I think two of the things that were really brilliant about it was the fact that they took actors that you had seen in every other type, sort of like celebratory works, like Ben Vereen, or like you know,
Cicely Tyson, or yeah,
Cicely
sure.
Tyson, exactly, who were playing these amazingly like, you know, monumental Black figures, but they also took like some of the most beloved father figures, you know, like, you know, the gentleman that played the Brady father, for instance, is like a horrible slave owner as well. You know, Ed
Oh,
Asner.
Robert, yeah.
Yes, you know, Ed Asner from like the Mary Tyler Moore Show,
Mhm.
you know, is terrible. You know, and I loved the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Anyway, so what it did to me is like it was the first time that I thought about my own Blackness, you know, because I saw people on this show that looked like my grandfather. They looked like someone that I love more than anything. And it was almost like when I went to school the next day. I remember talking to my friends about it. Yeah, that's how much it marked me. I was like, did you see Roots? You know, have you been watching this show? You know, and even at an early age, you know, that was something that was a turning point for me where I started to realize that, you know, that this thing called slavery happened, and it shifted America in a particular way. And I just never thought about the country the same again. And I know that's wildly interesting, you know, and just so young, you know what I'm saying? But it was Roots. That's the one. It was Roots. Yeah.
So Jody, I think I picked up that you probably saw SANKOFA relatively soon after it was released in the early 90s, but prior to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably when you asked the question, all of our minds went to Roots, because my mind went there as well, right? And I'm from Philadelphia. I don't think I mentioned. So I'm from a kind of, you know, a not only historic city, but a city that kind of thinks of history all the time. And so there's a kind of you know, certain kind of narrative that one imbibes in a way. And Roots was a major cultural event, right? I mean, literally, in my experience, so many of our neighbors and people across the city were really talking about it and hung on it every night. And the intervention was really slavery, right? Is this thing that, again, you know, kind of what John was talking about in terms of celebrities that you recognize, but scenarios that you're getting details about, right? That you certainly visually were not really exposed to. And it was a very kind of emotional, transformative kind of experience. And, you know, the idea that so many of us hung on these portrayals, these characters, the sort of Ben Vereen, you know, Chicken George, and all of these things that became kind of legendary, and long conversations about their personalities, their predicaments, etc. So yeah, so that was a big one, but also just I mean, I don't you know, have a kind of film category in my mind, but there's lots of other things that were before even that, right? So like Gone with the Wind, or some of the old
Yes.
sort of Hollywood
No, that's it. Yeah.
representation.
Yeah.
And so I think what we just watched is miles away from well, it's certainly miles away from that kind of really kind of two-dimensional, kind of very flat depictions of what plantation life was like, and really no interest in kind of the details of the lives of the enslaved in Gone with the Wind. And obviously Alex Haley is doing something really different, but I think this film is also doing something different even from what Haley. It's like, you know, there's a slight there's a completely different emphasis, I think, here that is really interesting and important, I think.
So thank you for touching on Gone with the Wind, because I actually, with some sort of little bit of embarrassment, but I do believe that Gone with the Wind is probably the one that really marks me as a child. I'm slightly older, it sounds like, than John. And I certainly remember Roots, but I have a memory of Gone with the Wind that predates Roots, and a certain kind of understanding of that way in which it depicted enslavement, lives of the enslaved, American history, but particularly Southern American history. I grew up in California, so there was also something like that was some other terrible place that did not have a connection to my life or the place that I was growing up in, but it still, you know, formed that way. And so I think about how that's, and so I think, you know, Jody, you just queued this up very perfectly. How distant, how much travel, how different SANKOFA is from even Roots itself, certainly from something like Gone with the Wind, and think about it in terms of our own personal relationships storytelling about enslavement in film or in video or in television, but also many other ways as well. So let's dive in and let's tell me a little bit about how this film marks you today, 2022, where you are in your aesthetic and your professional and your political and your academic careers. And when you see the film today, what are you seeing? Jody, you want to start?
This was stunning for me. And again, I hadn't thought about it really for a long time. So I was actually really excited to see that it was being remastered and re-released. And there's so many things that are powerful about the film. But I think right up there, first and foremost, is really the way he centers the lives of the enslaved, and literally the camera stays with them the entire time. And so it's really about shifting the story, literally. And so we don't get any time really with in the big house. Like, we see it at a distance. We don't see New Orleans. We don't see Jackson Square, right? We're in the fields, which is really interesting too, from the point of view of this diaspora thing that it's trying to evoke, because those fields literally could be in multiple places, even though we're in Louisiana. But just really the power of his framing of this story, and again, staying with these people who we, as a result, like, it really emphasizes their humanity and their emotional complexity, right? That these are people that that have complex relationships with themselves and also with each other. And so in terms of how that relates to my work and kind of where I am, I mean, I think kind of being trained as a historian and an academic historian, there's a way in which we kind of professionalize and we kind of in a way try to insert ourselves into a certain kind of conversation that's ongoing and certain kind of ways of communicating knowledge and information. And I think what he can do with this kind of filmmaking and storytelling really kind of reminds me, and I think kind of brings back to really the real importance of framing and the kinds of questions that we ask, and really trying to really bring forward the humanity of the people that we're talking about. And sometimes, as a historian working with documents that, of course, are coming out of all of these traumatic experiences and are generally produced by people who are causing those experiences, right? It can be hard to get back to that humanity and to center the people, right? And so one of the things I really admire about Gerima's work here is he's really opening up an entirely different world with all kinds of nuance and insight that actually center their, like I said, their humanity and the kind of resistance, right? The fact that these are people that we recognize in a way because we recognize their reactions, and they're in circumstances which are very difficult. And we sort of get to see them and follow them as they kind of respond in ways that we ourselves would recognize, because we could imagine perhaps what that might have been like. So I hope that gets to some of.
John, how are you? Like, how does this sit with you right now? Or
I mean,
maybe it doesn't sit with you, makes you, agitates you,
Right. It's a lot of things. First of all, I wanted to go back for a second because I was thinking about the fact, like, oh, why didn't I say Gone with the Wind? Right. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I think it was something that you touched on, Daryl, as far as like how, again, and Jody's kind of extrapolating a little bit more about the centering, right? And so I remember watching, they showed us Gone with the Wind in a civics class, actually, and when I went to high school. And so, it really wasn't about slavery, right? It was about Scarlett O'Hara, and I think that they totally missed that. Anyway, that was just something it just popped in my head. I was like, Gone with the Wind, of course. Anyway, I adore this film. I think it's masterful, and it deals with so many aspects of, as Jody's saying, the richness of the diaspora, but also just what I'm really focused on right now, which is like looking at speculative culture Black speculative culture as a way of making meaning in the world. And the term Sankofa really sits with me in a lot of different ways. I came with this notion of what I call Sankofaration. It's a portmanteau that I came up with that actually talks a lot about some of the underlying ways that Afrofuturism kind of talks about, Black interiority, Black futures. So the idea is that, Sankofa, of course, there's multiple meanings for it, but the most common one is like go back and get it, or this idea of learning from the past or bringing the past. This is Sankofa behind me. This is why I had it behind me. You're looking forward and backwards at the same time, right? And speaking about the simultaneity of time. And the other part is narration. I started to see a connection between the different types of speculative work that is fusing this really, really interesting way of looking at time and simultaneity with narration. So I came with this term Sankofaration. And so when I found out that Array was putting out Sankofa, and again, I own it on DVD. I've taught it in different classes. And I was just overjoyed. I might even said yes when I looked at the screen. It was like we're winning right now, right? And I was like, man, I get to share this with my students. And so when I taught my Afrofuturism class, which MCS 147, it was the first thing I showed them, right? Because I looked at it as a really, really brilliant exploration into different types of technologies, right? Because storytelling is a technology. It's a way that we understand the world. History is a technology. Religion is a technology. It's, people keep thinking about technology as a way through the methods that we're using right now, right? The hardware and software that are on our cell phones and such. But we have older technologies that Gerima actually presents to us, ancestral technologies that actually kind of connect us to disrupted pasts and hopefully better futures. And so I've been thinking.
Just give us an example for that, what you see as an ancestral technology in the film.
Well, so basically, the drum itself, for instance, is ancestral technology. When Sankofa is, and that's the other thing too. And I wonder about this, if Sankofa has actually become a person, or is he being ridden, or is he a vessel for the idea of Sankofa? That in itself has a technological aspect to it as well. But yeah, I think one of the most powerful things, of course, is the drums. And storytelling itself, is actually and actually intoning ancestral languages like Nunu does, to actually like change her surroundings. These are all, I think, ancestral technologies. The other thing I was thinking about really quickly, because I just love this, and I'm like, I get excited talking about it, is this is actually part of I think a system of different types of stories in science fiction and fantasy. Because I look at Sankofa as a speculative film as well, right? Because it's a time travel story, right? And so I kept coming across this trope of some type of traumatic event happening to a person that actually causes them to time travel. And of course, a very classic version of this is Kindred by Octavia Butler, right? Where Dana Franklin time travels, to the slave plantation in Maryland, but there's not a DeLorean or a TARDIS or any kind of time travel device. There's some type of existential time travel that's happening. So I came up with this term, dynia chronosomatic travel, right?
Say that for us one more time.
Dynia chronosomatic. And so basically dynia means pain, chrono of course means time, and somatic has to do with the body. And so I came up with this definition of speculative fiction trope that is signified in the narrative by a character time traveling without a machine due to various modes of other physical or mental pain or trauma exacted upon their person or state of mind. And so there are other versions of this, of course. Captain Blackman by John A. Williams, where a wounded soldier is actually time traveling to other Black soldiers' bodies, almost like Quantum Leap, the TV show Quantum Leap. Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, Far Beyond the Stars, where Benjamin Sisko is actually time traveling like this. And of course, the novel Stigmata, where a quilt actually causes the main character to actually relive in different ways, through time. And I just think that Gerima actually really dials into this trope really, really heavily and beautifully. And I don't know, it just kind of like, I think, reifies the fact that this is something that we've been dealing with for a long time. And it might not necessarily be, quote unquote traditional Afrofuturism, but it's definitely like a Black speculative work to me, especially like the importance of time and reclaiming the importance of our ancestral time.
So what what I'm hearing you thinking of, particularly about the character of Mona or Shola. I mean, she has this. She's in the castle and the dungeon part, and she has this event, and that is traumatic, absolutely traumatic when she sees the enslaved men around the fire, and I think they're women, and often a different area there, and then that lightning sort of thunder sound, and then with this time travel, back and also through space as well. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about Mona and Mona Shola, and why and how is it that Gerima chooses a woman, an African-American celebrity, who self-identifies as I'm an American, and she's a model, a fashion model, who then goes through this traumatic experience and becomes an enslaved plantation worker, though in the house, but also in dialogue with the fields. But particularly both a woman and a woman who is marked as being a woman in so many different ways. She's marked as being a woman in the exposure of her body to show that she's a woman, white male sexual violence against her as a woman, her communion with both other women, but also men, but in different ways and in very gendered ways. So talk to us a little bit more, both in terms of this time travel dimensions, but other ways that this story is constructed around a Black woman and a Black woman's body. The celebrity part, maybe I want to pull that just a little bit. Like, why start with a celebrity?
I mean, this is definitely one of the more provocative elements of the story for me, seeing it again this time. And I sort of question, because the kind of story, the narrative kind of hangs around her as a kind of figure who's the person who's kind of forgotten or has kind of gone astray in some way. And it's this kind of crisis that throws her back into this memory that she has either forgotten or suppressed. And so I was just wondering about what it means to center that experience on a woman character, and sort of wondering how of the different elements of this film and how they age, wondering how that plays in as a choice in this particular moment. But in terms of thinking about, I mean, the sexual violence that is sort of shown throughout this film, I mean, that's very hard and difficult to look at. But it's also really kind of an essential part of the story. And so it's part of the legacy of this experience, and also why it's so difficult to kind of recall and kind of take ownership of. And so that was just something I was thinking about in terms of that choice, because in some ways, I mean, we do get lots of different types of experiences and traumas, essentially, that different characters are going through in this film. But kind of featuring featuring this person as someone who is particularly deluded and kind of becomes the symbol of being lost on the one hand, and then later being found.
And reintegrated in her being
reintegrated. And so we don't get to think about, perhaps except with the exception of Joe, the sort of mulatto offspring, we don't get to think about an African man, a Black man, quote unquote, a Black African man who's lost, right? And who then has to kind of recover himself. So it's a question, but I think it works, but I think it's something that that we could question and ask about why that choice was made and kind of the implications of it. So,
I was thinking too, as you were speaking, Jody, and you allude to this too when you were first talking about the film, was the importance of lingering on the faces. And one aspect, of course, of slavery was like you were not supposed to make contact with the master's gaze, right? That's why I suppose these are things I've read about, and as far as like the subservient slave was not supposed to look directly into the master's eyes, and the eyes are so important, in this particular film. The scopophilic instinct is so important, and one of the first shots that we see in the film. You see SANKOFA on the drums, and the drums are kind of vibrating. And one of the first things you see are the two drums, and they look like eyes. They look like binoculars almost to me. And then you go into those, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, what he's setting up is this kind of like this tension between different types of gazes. You know, I think it's really important that Mona is a celebrity and that she is being objectified in a particular way, you know, through the white male gaze of the photographer, you know. And I think what it also brings to bear is the fact that photography is one of the first ways that society it starts to categorize. You know, once the technology of photography is invented, you know, one of the first things that it's used for is to kind of show, you know, the lack of intelligence of Black people, right, or enslaved people, you know, from the Agassiz photos, right, which are classic, and you know, through this representation, you know, she's being shown and she's delighting in the way that she's being shown. Like she's actually having a good time. She's actually celebrating being objectified in this way. And you know, and the first time that, you know, SANKOFA encounters her, you know, she is afraid of him and then tries to hide behind the white photographer, like she's hiding behind this particular construction, not realizing that she's being like abused and objectified in a particular way, you know. And I think that's one of the things that really struck me is the use of photography, the technology of photography in this fashion, or the way that her body's being seen, you know, in this particular way, and how she revels in it. And then to think about women, you know, I think first of all, like women are very important in speculative fiction in general. Like the dominant voices and the dominant teachers are Black women, and Black women in the film, particularly someone like Nunu, you know, is shown to be a really powerful storyteller, a really powerful conjurewoman, a really powerful mother for everyone, right? And so I think it's really interesting that when she time travels back, that, you know, Mona Shola, it loves Nunu, like she adores her. She wants to be more like her, right? And I think that is something that was really interesting. And the time travel device, as it turns like that particular longing into a really beautiful allegory. And I think it's about shifting how we are seeing ourselves, right? Instead of being objectified and seen through that particular lens, we should be seen through the lens of the drum. We should be seen through the lens of the buzzard, right? That kind of idea. So that's what I was getting from it.
Interesting. Well, let me
about women, just super quick.
Well, go ahead. Yeah, of course.
Just that I think another, and I appreciate what you were talking about, John, but I think another element here is the relationships that we see unfold between women, and this idea of kind of you know, knowledge between women and support and solidarity between women, and that's really important to this whole. In terms of Mona's kind of coming to a certain kind of consciousness, and as you were saying, she tunes into the storytelling and the power of Nunu, and vice versa in some way. And so him, you know, recovering that aspect of the story, right? So that they have power and kind of agency that's independent of the men around them, and actually even in a leadership role as well. So.
That's right. Yeah, she longs for that knowledge, right? That scene where she's like, "No, I want to listen to this. I love that part." Like, "Oh, you go. I'm gonna listen."
Yeah. So this idea of the gaze, you know, from the objectification of the gaze, the white male photographer through the camera, but then there's so many different close-ups, the portraits that the camera, Gerima, director camera has on these Black faces, and so many different. And you know, there's a line that I picked up that Joe says is all of them eyes staring at me right now. So he has this, you know, almost paranoia about also the internal gaze within the community, watching eyes. And so one thing that I was thinking, though, from a directorial choice, but I think it also maybe gets us into how to both represent, but also to imagine or not imagine the violence of enslavement, the terror, especially white terror, is the actual moments of the most extreme violence, the whippings, or the murder, even the murder of the master of the I guess he was the master, yeah. Who the camera actually shifts slightly away. You don't actually see the whip on the body. You hear it. So they're using other sort of, cinematic technologies. So how do you also sort of understand, how do you kind of work through this? What is possible to represent? What is impossible or too difficult when thinking about enslavement, when thinking about violence, when thinking about bodies? What you can see or really you cannot actually see that. Does this strike you as something that Gerima is trying to kind of work through in the play, work through in the film?
I definitely think so. I think it's a really good way to situate the story, which is highly traumatic in various ways, as Jody stated. Like, everyone's dealing with these different levels of either physical trauma, mental trauma, sense of loss. All these different things have been shown, and the whip is almost like the punctuation mark on these particular types of traumas, because it's punishing people for wanting to be free or to be seen as people, right? So it's almost like this the punctuation mark on that statement. And by not showing what's actually happening, he leaves us so much to the imagination, because our imaginations are much worse. It's like showing a monster in a monster movie, right? It's like that's disappointing, right? But the imagination of what could be happening is so palpable and gut wrenching as well. And also, the other thing is that both Joe and Noble, they don't want to exact this violence, and to me that's actually even more terrifying is the using of the headmen, so to speak, to exact the violence is it's extremely painful, to see, that they don't want to do this, but the system requires them to do so, or survival, in some ways, it's almost more painful than to hear the whip to me. Just the gut wrenching space. The look on Noble's face is it's just really painful for me to see.
Yeah, I think as a storytelling or a film, I'm not an expert, but just this idea of not showing it and actually hearing it and seeing facial reactions is even more powerful, because you kind of know, what is the point of showing it, right? We get the point, and actually by keeping us focused on these people, right, we're keeping focus on the story of their kind of experiences, and how they're dealing with it.
So Jody, when you think about you as a historian, so I presume, especially if you work in the 18th century, a lot of the work that a lot of your material is textual, and the description is very, very significant. Of course, absences is one of the texts. So how do you think about this question about violence, trauma, as in the visual vocabulary of it, developed by a filmmaker, and how you'd have to kind of analyze that and grapple with it and teach it when you're also thinking about this at the same time in textual materials? You're trying to explore, understand, know, teach, see, not see. How do the different mediums, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, well, violence is a tough one. But I think in my own work, like, I don't work specifically on the trade and on slaves and slavery. And really what I try to do is to think about this in the broader context of the larger society. And so I think one thing, and so there's multiple stories, there's multiple histories, there's multiple issues to kind of keep track of. And one of the problems with the documents, right, is that a lot of the documents are produced in the context of the trade, and this is a trade, right? So it's business. So there's business documents, or they're commercial records, and so that's a kind of, and the kind of anonymity and the kind of objectification of people is a kind of violence that you necessarily have to confront and unpack as you're thinking about the kinds of arguments that you can make or want to make. But I think that one thing in terms of this film and the storytelling and the issues around slavery, I think that is kind of grappling with the commercial aspect of it, and the sort of economic aspect of it, because the violence isn't happening, just because people are mean or just because they don't like whatever, right? The violence is happening because of this commercial kind of this context, and this push for profit. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this, about a lot of the contemporary issue in slavery and thinking about social justice and anti-Blackness and all of that, is really in this moment that we're in now. People we're also thinking a lot about capitalism and kind of economy and kind of how to create sort of perhaps more just systems. And so the question of talking about all of these issues of the slave trade, I think one of the things that could probably be brought out more with this film is like thinking about this stuff isn't happening, in a vacuum. It's happening because we're building a society that is driven by this search for profit, and that is what is kind of pushing the excessive cruelty. And so I don't know if that gets to your question, but I think that these are issues that have to kind of be balanced and sort of all brought forward.
John, when you're thinking about how this film sits alongside the courses that you teach, the themes that you've already introduced some of about Afrofuturism, for instance, Black superheroes, among others. How does the film both complement but also sometimes sit in tension with big themes, big texts that you're trying to work through?
Well, like I said, that the idea of SANKOFA, I think, is really, just the Anchor stamp itself, as a graphic motif is part of how I think about, some of the more design elements that came over with the slaves, that idea of the Anchor stamp surviving is just really an amazing feat just to save those particular stories. That's why I love Nunu so much, because she's a carrier of information. And as a designer, I'm thinking a lot about some of the things that Jody's talking about too, like the banality of design when it comes to the slave trade. That's something I think about a lot in my own work around what I call critical race design studies, thinking about races and Blackness as these deliverables that are created in this particular trade, right? So that's something I think about a lot. Just how these documents actually in some ways are like really beautifully designed, actually very functional, but they unmake people and turn people into objects, right? One of the things I really keyed in a lot of, and I think about naming conventions too. Obviously, I make up a lot of names, right? So like Shango, for instance, right? Shango is one of my favorite characters, and as I recall, the god Shango, whose colors are red and white, he was wearing red and white, is like the arbiter of justice, as I recall. He stands for justice, the god of fire and lightning and thunder.
Wow.
Nunu has so many different reasons, has so many different rationales. I mean, her name was almost Pan-African because there's so many different meanings for, but all of them were wonderful. It's like mother, it was madam. There's one that says her name means everything. So losing Nunu means losing everything. And of course, Shola, which I think means one who is blessed and something like that. So a lot of times when I'm talking about like the inner workings of, speculative narratives, why are people being named these things, and why are we actually talking about these particular connotations? The tensions about it, because I taught this in horror classes too, because there's a certain amount of utility to horror, and terror. These ideas of actually, showing and not showing. You were saying, Daryl, earlier, but and unpacking these demons, and talking about them is, I think, this particular film is very good for that. But it's a difficult film. It's difficult to deal with these particular stories and histories, and that's why we're having these debates around critical race theory now in our country, right? Because America doesn't want to deal with its past. It doesn't want to deal with the demons that are in those particular stories, right? So let's just ignore them. But obviously that is not the way to heal, right? So I think the tensions are like some people are looking at Black horror as some people call it trauma porn, these kind of things, not realizing that trauma is actually part of the discourse, that it's actually part of the affect, you know. And I think that's a particular tension I've been thinking about a lot of is, you know, sometimes you have to name that ghost so you can control it. You know, this is about a haunted space. You know, this one has been haunted by a past. You know, this is to me is like a possession narrative. It's a ghost story. It has semblances to, like I said, works like Kindred, which I deem a horror story actually, or Beloved even. You know, which is both a possession and poltergeist story. I mean, there's these different aspects of horror that I think people don't want to delve into. In some ways, I think these particular types of narratives gives us a certain amount of distance so we can look at this. These particular issues, they're very complex and difficult to deal with. And I think horror, science fiction, fantasy, the fantastic in general gives us a way to look at these things. There's a book by Rebecca Hall actually that reminds me of this film too. It's called Wake. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a story. It's a collection of stories about Black women-led slave revolts, but it's told through a graphic novel, and it's told through this kind of speculative narrative, right? And so it becomes again, he becomes this. Gerima's work becomes part of this continuum of ways to deal with this kind of work, and I think I don't know if it's necessarily a tension. I think it's a celebratory space to me. You know, just borrowing from the text, he said, "This is a story. This is not about slavery. It's about resistance." You know, and I think there's all these people are superheroes, right? To me, you know, because they survive. You know, their stories survive. You know, and carry on. So those are some of the things that I talk about in the course, as far as like looking at these as types of technologies that predate, you know, the cell phone, so to speak. You know, anyway.
So, you know, both of you have touched on, you know, how you put this in dialogue in your classes and other types of texts. You know, I was wondering, have either one of you had an opportunity yet to look at the learning guide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where I got that reference from. Yeah, the resistance.
Okay, good. So I was also going through it. You know, it's very fresh for us all. So we may have had enough time to go through. And, you know, particularly all the navigations is quite interesting because you think you're on one page and it takes you to another place here and another resource here. But when you think about it, and one of the things I was struck by is how the learning guide incorporates many things which are not about slavery, not about Africans. You know, there's a thing about Rigoberta Menchú, a Guatemalan indigenous activist, revolutionary, and her transformation, which is, you know, in part, I was like, well, this is kind of like Mona's transformation as she goes through this revolutionary consciousness process. And so when we think about also, you put this film and its themes, its forms, its language in dialogue with topics and texts and figures who are outside of broadly the African diaspora, broadly the slave trade. What conversations are coming up for you?
Well, I mean, to the degree that this is about resilience and resistance, I think that is a human, you know, those are human attributes that are important and valuable in just in so many instances. And so this idea of their humanity and the ways in which they uphold that in the face of all of this kind of degradation. I mean, I think there's any number, and I think it's actually kind of exciting to think about the ways in which it speaks to the human experience more broadly in situations completely unrelated to Atlantic slavery. And I think one of the challenges with thinking about this time period and its legacies is the fact that it's always been kind of suppressed and marginalized and made to seem like not related to anything else, you know, and that's part of the whole legacy of the sort of suppression of Black humanity in the first place. But if we can, and part of what he's doing here and part of what makes this such a classic film and the way he engages these really fundamental questions is that it can become part of this effort to really bring this experience into much larger conversations that perhaps we're more familiar with having and thinking about the humanity of non-Black people, right? And that we can now bring the humanity of Black people into that larger conversation in a, very direct way. So, so I don't have any specific examples. I think there's probably many, but I think that that's what's really powerful. And I think that there's interest in this. I think I just saw there's a big series coming out this month, the Black History Month, talking about 1,000 years of slavery, right? Which again sets this Atlantic slave trade in a global kind of way, right? Which can remove so much of the baggage that Americans we have about this topic, right? And can kind of begin to see that this is a problem that is with us, right? It has us being humans, and that and it's still with us, right? And so almost like Mona, like as we can kind of, this idea of trying to forget about it and move on doesn't really work, right? Because it overwhelms us. It imposes itself on us at different moments.
It takes you.
It takes over.
Yeah, exactly.
And so yeah, I think that's what's really powerful and successful about what Gerima's doing.
It definitely was ahead of its time, and I think it's no. I guess it's serendipitous, But the film came out in 1993. The term Afrofuturism is coined the same year. It's published by Duke in like 1994. But so all these different speculative things are happening in the 90s as far as like what Blackness is, and in response to like the political climate. There's also, of course, like an uptick in Black creativity as far as like transmedia storytelling that I kind of like situate, because we talk about like what's happening in the media and what's the context of the media, right? I always kind of teach it in juxtaposition with another time travel story, Daughters of the Dust, as well, because the Daughters of the Dust came out in like 1991 as a Julie Dash film, but the time traveler is the spirit of a child, who is speaking to us, from the future and actually haunting to a certain degree the present. And I just love this way that the Black speculative radical thought like really messes with time. It kind of like reclaims the history of the future, as Lisa Yazek says, right? And that's something that the connectivity that he's showing. It's all about connectivity, right? We're all connected, and that's one of the parts that really resonate with me. I don't feel there are traumatic things that happen in the film, obviously, right? But I always feel joyous when I watch it and moved, by the film in a particular way. And I think when I showed this to my students, this is the first time they had seen it, and none of the students had ever seen it before. They were moved, that they were connected to it. They understood like how it resonated and why it was such an important film, and why Array had to restore it and put it up again. We had a very, 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 very wonderful conversations about it, in my Afrofuturism and aesthetics course, because of that. And I think the technologies that are drawn, the technologies of storytelling, like I said, the ancestral work that's been done, going back and getting this. I mean, essentially, like Array is doing SANKOFA, right? They're practicing SANKOFA, right? By going back and getting this piece and giving it back to us. They're doing SANKOFA-ration, right, through these technologies. I think that's really important to acknowledge. They're salvaging these things. And when I think about this, another film that pops into my head, of course, is The Last Angel of History by John Confronts. It's a 1997 film. It's more about like digital music and technology, but he talks about time travel too. And the trope that he uses is this thing called a data thief, which is a time traveling archaeologist and historian that's trying to put together pieces of Black speculative work, throughout history. And he uses this term of Black secret technology, and that Black secret technology is the blues. And I was like, oh my goodness, it's just like, it really expands how we think about these technological aspects that I think are really, really prevalent in the film, and I think in just Black, cultural discourse as well.
So, John, you sort of you touched upon a question that I wanted to ask both of you. And a film that is so troubling, can be so troubling, and just wrenching for us as viewers and for the characters that we're accompanying. You touched here about things that you drew inspiration and pleasure. I don't know, comfort is exactly the right word, but some sort of fulfillment in the topic this construction, the entire experience here.
Mhm.
So, and we put in that in dialogue with Afrofuturism and some of the themes, the longer sort of intellectual and cultural traditions that fascinate you, that animate you. So I asked Jody here, where might you find fulfillment, comfort, pleasure? I think is a very difficult word to use in this film, but something that you can take with you that rises your spirits. If these are the right, if I'm getting the frame here, it's a good film. Yeah, there are many good films out there, but
yeah, pleasure is a little tricky and difficult. They're very fleeting, kind of, and small. I think one of the things I felt is just really provoked and kind of like, aha, this is interesting, because one of the things I picked up this time that I didn't remember, because there's a lot of symbolism throughout this.
Yeah.
And I was really provoked and curious and kind of like wanting to think about this more, or talk about this more. So there's many different kinds of symbolism, but the sort of mother son kind of Madonna and child story that runs through. And what that said to me is the filmmaker is so bold, and he takes on a number of issues, but he takes on really hard issues. And this question of paternity on the one hand, and kind of identity, but then the church, right?
Mhm.
And if we're trying to sort of recenter a Black diaspora experience in Africa, in a kind of African kind of sort of center or origin, how do we think about this legacy of the church and how the enslaved sort of encountered it? And so the reversal of the Madonna, of the mother and child, with him, the priest in his ear, and heathen, and turn away from your mother, right? And then he lays her on the altar.
Mhm.
At the end. And so you're totally, taking on the premise of the kind of civilizing mission, and that, this is part of, what is supposedly, good about the, what was transferred to the enslaved. And so I was like, this is really bold. So I don't know about, and that really, it makes me want to talk to other people about it. And did you
Mhm.
see that? And like, wow, like, what are we to make of this, right? And so I don't know if pleasure, but I feel like he's feeding us in some way, or inspiring us to also think about some of these sort of bigger questions that are endearing, that don't really have easy answers either.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we're near the end of our conversation here, but I want to invite each of you an opportunity to share, one more thought that you think is that's sitting with you right now, that's with you as you've seen the film again and this conversation.
Jody spoke about, the symbolism really quickly, and I didn't realize this until I think I might have looked up fairly recently, the use of the buzzard symbolism, and it seems that the buzzard is actually very similar to the scarab in Egyptian belief structures, where it's about self-realization, self-creation, which I didn't realize until fairly recently. So that's very interesting, because the buzzard is actually focused on a lot. In fact, they said that some people believe that a giant buzzard grabbed Nunu and took her back to Africa, this kind of thing. And so I thought that was really interesting, because, like Black folk, the buzzard is demonized and treated in this kind of very negative connotation around death and being a carrion creature. But, we are looking through a different lens, so to speak, because we start off looking through that drum. We're looking through this from an Africanized, African diasporic lens, and the buzzard becomes like this really powerful symbol for recreation, which I thought was really wonderful. The other thing I thought, I love the use of root work and conjure so much in the film, like the idea of using like natural remedies and other types of technologies that were brought over by slaves to to heal each other and to learn from their environment, and to use like roots and and herbs and these other like
the bows on the wounds.
oh yeah, definitely
Sound,
all
yeah.
of this. Well, and also
Yeah.
too the love potion,
Mhm.
you know, that was given to Joe, and you know, all these different ways.
Oh,
These
right.
are other like again matrilineal, mostly matrilineal, like you know, group working traditions that are in it too. So I thought that again, it was like inspiring because of that, and you know, also the last thing, you know, her obviously being killed during this riot, but actually her spirit flying, you know, which reminded me so much of Virginia Hamilton's work. The people could fly, you know, this idea of the spirit being released and being and going back to the source, so to speak, as Gerima mentions, was inspiring. Like you said, not pleasurable, but you know, definitely like emotionally effective. So.
Mhm.
I think I really appreciate the boldness of this film. I guess that's one of the last things I would mention in terms of I'm really kind of inspired, like seeing it again and thinking about kind of where I am in my work and relationships and you know teaching students and publishing about this topic versus whatever it was 30 years ago when this came out, and really appreciating his you know the sense that a lot of times as scholars people you know we sort of work in isolation and we're working against in some sense this much bigger kind of world, and sometimes the questions that we're asking don't necessarily get validation in the short term, and his ability to kind of a sort of go off the beaten track and not be as sort of afraid of that, and to pursue questions that were really rooted in the people that he wanted to tell a story about, even though those people aren't often centered as authoritative sources of knowledge. And so I guess I'm inspired by his pursuit of this intervention and what ultimately is so became so successful about it, and that you know we made this film, and then it really does, I think it has aged well. I think it really communicates important issues really well, and so I'm inspired by the fact that he did that. I also think that this is not the last word, right? He's also kind of pushing us to that. There's so many stories, right? That this kind of gestures to that we could also talk about, and so um, I guess that's kind of it. Sort of gives me sort of energy a little bit to kind of press on and it's amazing how you know he found a community in the short term when it came out and was you know really validated by sort of local Black communities around the country, but then how much larger is that community 30 years later, you know, as
Mm-hmm.
as it's picked up, and kind of the national kind of conversation is also 30 years down the road, right, and sort of ready in a certain way.
Yeah.
And than it was last when it first came out.
So I'm going to invite Nikolai Maslov, the film curator from UCR Arts, to join us. Nikolai's been working not just with this film, but with other films that are difficult and challenging and inspiring. And for those of you who have not been yet to UCR Arts, I believe Nikolai can remind us, but I believe we're going to go back to in-person screenings quite soon. But we continue to do virtual screenings. So Nikolai, please tell us a little bit about what we should think of being, what we should have in our mind as we close out the evening.
Williams, and hi everybody, my name is Nikolai Maslov, curator of film and media projects at UCR Arts, and I just want to say thank you to the team at Array for this event and all of our panelists for this conversation. So I also want to invite everybody down to UCR Arts. We're the off-campus art museums of the University of California, Riverside, located 2 miles off campus in downtown Riverside. We screen films, host exhibitions, talks, and events, and more could be found at ucrarts.ucr.edu. Related to tonight and opening on March 19th, we'll have a few exhibitions opening by Black Kirby, which is the artistic collaborative duo of John Jennings and Stacey Robinson. And with all that said, thank you everybody and have a good night.
Thanks, Nikolai. So I want to thank everyone at Array for this opportunity to see this film together, even though we watched it individually, and to have this conversation. I also want to thank Array for inviting the team at enslaved.org, which is a online open source digital discovery tool for the lives of the enslaved, to inviting us to contribute to the learning guide. And so on behalf of the team there, I'd like to express my gratitude for being part of this conversation. And most importantly, I want to thank John and Jody for their expertise and their spirit of this conversation. And I look forward to hearing more about the research and the impact that they have with their students, and all those good things. Of course, health to everyone, and I wish everyone a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.